Okay, I'm here with Ronnie Pontiac. Ronnie, thanks a lot for making the time to speak with me today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's nice to see we're both having a good hair day as well, you know.
Thank you. I know we understand
I
each other.
I I was just remembering I saw a video where two druids were talking, modern druids from the UK, and one of them was joking with the other that you should never trust a prophet who doesn't have curly hair. So like all real prophets
Really?
have curly hair.
That's interesting. I think I can imagine exceptions. I often think about cavaliers when I'm meeting podcasters with long hair, especially if they're sporting the mustache and the small beard. I'm like I'm happy to meet a fellow cavalier.
Cavalier. What exactly is a cavalier? Because I know the term, but I'm thinking maybe something like the Three Musketeers. But
It was actually a group that we probably wouldn't want to be involved with. They were the English royalists at the time when there was a battle between Cromwell and the royalists. And so you could tell the Puritans because they always had their hair very controlled and generally did not like facial hair. They were not allowed to laugh very loudly. They were not allowed to run or dance. The Cavaliers generally had long hair and very stylish beards, and they liked to wear big cod pieces. And they loved to drink and were famous as what they called wenchers. And so they could not be more different, both representing examples of English temperament, but they were so very different. And I do believe that America, by the way, inherited that psychological split.
mm, yeah, well, that's what we're going to talk about when we get into your book, American Metaphysical Religion. Um, but I would love to, I think you've lived a pretty interesting life, and I was hoping that you could take us back to just before you met Manly P. Hall, the author of the famous Secret Teachings of All Ages. Because I'm interested in like what it was like for you before you met him and how that meeting changed things. Because I feel like that was a pivotal moment in your life that led to you eventually writing this sprawling history of metaphysical religion in America. Would you mind just taking us back there and we can just follow along?
Sure. I was very lost as a kid. I had atheist parents who were war survivors who were much older than parents usually are. My whole family were war survivors, and they were not very settled into American culture. They were rather afraid of it. And so I was overprotected and overcontrolled and not allowed to actually become an American kid. I actually spoke with an accent when I first entered school, and I was also a runt. I was really a small kid for my age, and I got beat up a lot. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, a lot of gang activity, and I was beat up by all sides. I had no one to turn to, and so I got really bitter as I hit early teenage, and by the time I hit late teenage, I had a relationship that didn't go all that great with kind of a girl that was in the range of hippie sort of mentality, and um, she wound up cheating on me and dumping me. So that even furthered this attitude I had. So by the time I was 17, I decided this was all bullshit, and I wasn't going to play along with anybody. I dyed my hair black, started wearing all black. I started a nihilist band that was became very popular among bikers who were white supremacists of all things. And I had this attitude of just wanting to ruin every party and be as destructive as I could and hopefully die young and famous was basically the plan. And by the time I was 17, 18, I was drawing these huge crowds that it was kind of an Altamont almost scene. There was a lot of violence going on. Very fortunate that nothing really terrible happened to anyone, including myself. while I was doing those things. And the first turning point for me was when I was at a rather notorious club, and there was a girl there who looked completely out of place. And she was terrified because there was a group of about 5 guys that were cornering her, and she didn't know who to turn to. And she had been warned by the club owner to stay away from me, but for some reason she chose me as her champion. I guess I was probably the most threatening looking guy in the club. And I was really, no one had ever asked me for help. I'd never been in a position like that. I really felt moved. And also the fear that she felt was so obvious. So I backed them down with the help of my drummer, and then I made sure she got home safely. And of course, we wound up falling in love, and she wound up moving in with me, and she's my wife now. And that was a huge turning point for me because she was so different, a very quiet person, but very positive in her own way. And she didn't really understand what I was trying to do or why I was trying to do it. And she found what I was doing to be somewhat reprehensible. And she believed that there was a better me in there somewhere than this petty criminal and rabble rouser. And then not too long after that, my experience of spirituality and metaphysics was very limited at that point. When I started my band, I was drawn to the usual psychopathic literature, Hitler. I was looking into Anton LaVey and Crowley and Spare, although I wouldn't consider them at all psychopathic. Just looking for power, and I was disappointed by what I found in these writers, because in actuality they're very creative and they've got positive things to teach. And that's not what I wanted. That's about all I had. And I really thought there were only 2 sides to the story: monotheism on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had to go with Satan because that's all there was. Having been raised atheist, I really didn't have much education in religion. I had some light teachings, and that was about it, because my family leaned in on my parents about, he's got to know his heritage kind of stuff, but none of that stuck with me. So one book that did appeal to me when I was a kid was a book called Atlantis, Mother of Empires, that I saw in the shop, and it was this big tome. And I don't know why, but it just really struck my imagination, and I wanted to shoplift the thing, and it was way too big, and I remembered it for a long time. And later I found out, oddly enough, that the book was by the architect that had built PRS for Manly Hall. So in a weird way, I was intuiting this future. And I got some money meant for a haircut, and I took it to the Bodhi Tree bookstore, which was an incredible bookstore in Los Angeles for years. It's no longer there. And I was looking in their used branch, which was a little house next door, really quaint and charming. And I was looking for a copy of Atlantis, Mother of Empires, but they didn't have it. But I did find this tome. It was a 6th edition, which is a reduced size, but still a large edition of the Secret Teachings of All Ages with thick paper. But this is when it was called the Encyclopedic Outline. And so it seemed to me to be this ancient book. I thought the guy was surely gone, the author. But it appealed to me so much, the art in it and the things it was talking about. Just at first glance, I thought, oh, wow, I've got to have this. So I put it on layaway, and eventually I paid for it, brought it home, and started to read it chapter by chapter. And I felt like somebody had I felt like I'd been living in a closet my whole life, like in some claustrophobic, dark space where I didn't know what was going on or why I was here or what the point of any of it was. And I had no faith in anything except nature. And here was this book dedicated to the rational soul of nature. And it had all this amazing information and art by people who had risked their lives, really, in many cases, to experience and to share the information that they had discovered. And I was so moved and so inspired by that. So at the time, I was going through a major earthquake paranoia brought on by some friends of mine who were moving to Virginia Beach because the Edgar Cayce teachings had really gotten to them, and they thought that California was going to wind up on the bottom of the sea any minute. And they got to me too. And so I went to them to talk to them, and the matriarch of the family, this wonderful Carney woman, really cool person, she I told her about the book, and she said, "Oh, well, he's still lecturing just down the street from you. Really, it's a short drive." Well, I was stunned. Really? Yeah, every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. for $1.
And
I can,
this is in Los Angeles
yeah, in
or
Los
the
Feliz,
area?
a
Yeah.
suburb of
Mm,
Los Angeles. And so he was at his Philosophical Research Society, PRS, doing a lecture every Sunday for decades, and he was still doing it. So I was afraid to go, knowing who I'd been and what I had done. I just thought that when I walked in there, he'd see stains all over my soul. Although I wouldn't have
mm.
put it that way then, because I was still an atheist. And I was afraid to go. I just thought I'd be rejected, and I couldn't handle that because I was so moved by everything I'd found in this one book. But eventually, my girlfriend and my friends prevailed on me, and they said, you should really go down there. I mean, he's really getting up there, and it's an opportunity to see him, and why would you miss that? So I worked up the courage, and we went down there on this beautiful afternoon, and the people were all so kind and nice, and they were talking about all the conversations I heard snippets of were so fascinating. I heard all kinds of words I'd never heard before, and then when I sat down and listened to him lecture, he looked right at me and he said, people who have paranoia about earthquakes, irrational fears about earthquakes because they have guilt about how they've lived their lives.
Mm.
I later found out that he couldn't see me. His vision was not very good by that point. But he somehow managed to do that, look right at me and say that to me. And then later, when I became his assistant and his screener, I ran into so many people, excuse me, who had the same experience, who would be at the lecture and he would look right at them and he would say something that seemed to be a direct message for them that they've been waiting to hear.
Mm.
So obviously I was really impressed. And I was like, I've got to be around this guy. I've got to be around this community. So, excuse me for a moment here.
Yeah, I wonder, before moving on, if you could just paint the picture for us of what the Philosophical Research Society was like. You mentioned a book by the architect, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
guessing this wasn't just like a converted craftsman home or something. But
No,
could you describe like what the building was like and like how
sure.
large the meetings were on those Sundays?
Yeah. Well, it was beautiful. It is beautiful architecture. It's a combination of Mayan and Egyptian. Some call it neo-Mayan. It has, for instance, there's a big library, and the library has these carved wooden doors with Confucius and Plato on them. And
Mm.
then there's a gift shop. This is a quaint little glass windowed gift shop in which he would sometimes put little treasures for very cheap prices. Excuse me. There's a lot of stuff in the air over here. So you could find like an amazing tea set from Japan that would be anywhere else would be hundreds and hundreds of dollars for like $30 or something. It was just a kind of a gift that he did to his community. Then there was a big auditorium, and you could seat a couple hundred people in there who would be in there every Sunday. And that had a portrait of him when you walked in. And there was a big velvet chair sitting on the stage, and that's where he would come and sit and give his lectures. Then there was his office, which was adjacent to the library, and then above it, or connected to the library, which was two stories, there's a lecture room. And then there's a shipping area with some offices connected to it. So it was this wonderful little complex in this kind of pinkish, amberish almost, not, I don't want you to think it was too bright, the colors, but like a muted pink amber sort of color. And with these Mayan kind of decorations around it, and then an Egyptian statue here or there with an inspiring message to the truth seekers of all time was the plaque that was on it. And then you'd go inside the library, and beyond this incredible collection of metaphysical books, there was a collection of art from all over the world. So there was a giant Tibetan prayer wheel, and there were these huge Buddhas. There was this one that I really loved, that was a Buddha with all these little Buddhas connected to it. And so it was just a place where everything that your eyes fell on was inspiring. A cute little rose garden, and they would have refreshments after the lecture there. You have a little something to drink and some cookies that people brought along. And there was one woman in particular who would bring these gorgeous flower arrangements to his every lecture and put them up on the stage. So it really was almost a family community kind of feeling, but it didn't have any of the pretense that you normally find in those kind of communities. Everything was very humble and down home. And I guess this was because of the time that we were there. We were really lucky. Tamara and I got there at a time when they were all much older. The famous people that used to hang around there weren't there anymore. The place was being run by women who were mostly the widows of men who had run the place. But it made it this idyllic, supportive little environment. And so Tamara and I decided we want to volunteer. We want to be near this and help it in some way. So the next day, on Monday morning, we went down there, and they were gracious enough to let us have a meeting with one of the people that was running the place. And she asked us questions, and Tamara gave all the right answers because Tamara had office skills and things that they wanted. So they said, oh, yeah, we could definitely have a position for you. And what about you? And I didn't have anything, as you can imagine. I mean, what was I going to say? I know a lot of bikers. I used to, it was just useless. And I could tell it wasn't going to end well. But she did ask me, do you have any facility with languages? And I said, well, I grew up around a lot of languages because my parents and my family were all from Europe. So there was Russian and French, and there was Polish and German. And so I was hearing these things when I grew up. And she said, okay, well, we'll get back to you if we can think of anything for you. But Tamara, let us know. And so went home. I was at that point in my life, I was still in every way just messed up. So I was like, well, you're not going to have a job working down there, and they don't even want me. Screw that. It was that kind of attitude.
Are you still like in your 20s at this point? So still pretty
barely,
young?
Yeah.
Okay. So the attitude was still kind of fuck the world, but there was like a ray of sunshine trying to creep into your life.
Exactly. And so then to my shock, I got a call a day or two later where they told me that Manly Hall wanted to meet me. Wow. Okay.
How old is he at this time?
He was, I think, around 80. I'm not sure his exact age, but he was definitely either 79 or 81 or somewhere in that area. And so
how long would he lecture for on Sundays?
90 minutes without any notes.
So he still had a lot of energy.
He was amazing. I'll as I finish the story, I will tell you a little about that. Yeah. So what happened was they said he wants to meet you. I went down there. They led me to his office, this beautiful big room with all this art in it, this huge Japanese altar, and this carved Chinese desk that he sat behind was massive, and the carvings were incredible. And the whole room had this, I've never been in a place with a feeling like that. It feels like what a temple should feel like. Tranquil, just charged with some sort of a energy that felt so comforting and powerful. And so he was sitting behind his desk. He had two women on either side of him standing, and these were the women who ran the place, and they were kind of giving me the skunk eye. And he said, come on in and make yourself miserable, in this kind of W.C. Fields voice, and have a seat. So I sat down. He asked me a couple questions, and he had a big stack of paper in front of him, and he pushed it in front of me, and he said, this is the galley for my alchemical bibliography, and I want you to work on it for me. I said, I don't know what a galley is. I don't know what a bibliography is. And the only reason I know anything about alchemy is your book. And I am definitely not the right person for this. I don't have the education. He said, no, you'll be fine. I'll guide you. Don't worry about it. Go ahead, take it and get to work.
He's handing you a curriculum for your education right there, I would think.
Oh boy. Yeah, you have no idea, because what happened next was even more incredible. So his vice president, a very serious woman who'd served in the military and who kind of ran the whole financial side of the place, she had run around the side of the library and headed me off. And she said, give me that. That was a mistake. And that was a relief. I felt good about that. Good. Right. I mean, I'm glad to meet him, but no, this would have been a disaster. Get home. There's a call from his secretary. Mr. Hall, you in his office first thing tomorrow morning. Okay. I go in there. Now he's by himself. pushes the galley back in front of me. He says, "This is your job." I say again, I don't have the skills for this. I would love to do this, but I don't want to let you down. He says, "I will meet with you every morning and let you know what I think you should work on. And I will have lunch with you in the vault whenever possible so that you can look at the books and ask me questions about them." Now, how about that for a curriculum? His
Hmm.
vault was this huge safe filled with rare manuscripts and books, incredibly rare. And I was able to pick up anyone I wanted and have him tell me things about it. And so he said, then in the afternoon, we're about to call it a day, I will go over the work with you and see how you've done. And so you'll be fine. And he said, from now on, you take orders only from me. If anybody else
Great.
contradicts anything I tell you, you come
Yeah,
tell me.
that's great.
Yeah, so I could not say no to that arrangement. And it turned out to
Yeah,
be not only the beginning of this book that we're discussing, but also my opportunity to be around this man who, in his 80s, not only was he able to give a 90-minute lecture without any notes, with dropping names and dates and never making a mistake, it seemed, but he would be working on multiple things at once. So he taught me how to do this. He would work on a book, two books, three books at the same time, each at a different stage of completion. He would be working on articles for his journal that came out monthly. He would be deciding what lectures he would be giving for the following season. He would be overseeing the business and everything else, meeting with people, because he had a lot of people who came to him seeking help. And I always thought of him as a last resort for people. They would get into trouble
hmm
doing things that amplified underlying problems, and they would come to him asking, what do I do about this entity? What do I do about this dimension I can't close? Or what do I do about? And eventually he came to trust me enough and Tamra enough that he made us his screeners, because there were too many people wanting to meet him and he didn't have
hmm
time. As he got older, he did, that's one way he slowed down, was I can't meet everybody that comes to me. I need somebody to screen this. And his secretary used to do it for him, but she had so much work too, working with him, taking dictation for the books and overseeing production and all that. So that was also an incredible education, to see who came to him, to see what they wanted, to see what kind of
Right.
damage can happen to people. And so, and he could also say to me, there's a book I need for this article. You're going to find it up in the second story on the right corner. It'll be in the second shelf. This is the title. The cover's red, over and over again. So his mind and his energy level were just incredible. It changed my whole concept of aging, because I'd been
hmm
around people who, as they aged, became very fragile and angry and frightened. And here was this incredible genius just popping out books. And you can argue, I think, that maybe his last books were not at the level of the earlier books, but they were still very useful, very helpful, and fascinating. And he was still quite eloquent. And
hmm
so it was very impressive.
Yeah. As you describe him and the kind of scene around him and this temple to, I don't know, the occult arts or the esoteric arts that he created, uh, what I'm seeing a lot of parallel between him and Carl Jung, and with like a kind of exhaustive knowledge of all these esoteric things, and being someone who people went to for help when they had, you know, reached their limit. Uh, I mean, would you say that that's kind of accurate, that he's in a way a kind of an American Carl Jung, but maybe not one who's so afraid to embrace his identity as an occult scholar or practitioner?
Right. Yes. I think, well, first they were in contact at one point.
Hmm.
Jung was asking Hall for copies of manuscripts, alchemical manuscripts that he had, because during I think it was during the 40s, so he couldn't come to Los Angeles to see them. And he wanted any kind of copy that could be made so that he could examine these manuscripts.
Mhm.
There's also a book that Manly Hall wrote. I think it's called Disciplines of Self-Realization or Disciplines of Unfoldment, something self-realization. I don't quite remember it right now, but that was certainly influenced heavily by Jung.
Mhm.
And I do see them as being similar in ways, in the sense that both of them were such appreciators of world culture,
Mhm.
spirituality, and art, and such attention to symbolism and the meaning behind symbolism, so that you definitely see a similarity in their interest in how to interpret experiences, or how the conscious and unconscious may work and communicate with each other, or in the various kinds of disciplines that can be done to improve one's life. And I did have a conversation with him once where I asked him if he had it all to do again, would he change anything about what he had done? And this brings us to the fact that earlier in his life, he was much more, let's use the word aggressive, as somebody that interviewed me not too long ago used, about the way that a lot of metaphysical teachers have a certain kind of aggressiveness in their belief system and in the way that they present it. And
Mhm.
at the time that I knew him, there was none of that. I mean, it was so, I don't even know how to explain it. It was, I often use
He was kind of
Taoist.
like it, yeah, like becoming more at ease, not feeling so maybe compelled to um, speak up or to be forceful in the way of communicating.
Yes. And also
Yeah.
less concerned about the the um the power aspect of it, if you will. Less
Uh,
concerned with that, and more concerned with how to find the harmony in life and to move
right.
in
Like
that
you said, more
harmony.
Taoist. Yeah.
Yeah. And so,
So
and he
less
was
about manipulating elemental forces and more working with them, collaborating, being in
exactly.
harmony with. Huh.
Exactly. You could say
Nice.
perhaps that he switched from a metaphysician to a mystic. Maybe that's one way to put it, depending on one's definition of those words. But I've heard those words defined in that way, that metaphysics, excuse me, like magic, is a practical approach, and that mysticism is more seeking the harmony. Or we could
Hmm.
even go further back and look at Iamblichus and say Plotinus. And Plotinus is saying that if you want to reach divine consciousness, if you want to really understand the good, the true, and the beautiful, you can climb the ladder of beauty using the intellect of the heart, right? And you can see the good and the true and the beautiful, starting with something that's perhaps just a physical object or person, and then moving up that ladder until you reach the one. Whereas Iamblichus
Mhm.
said, no, you can't do that. The only way to achieve that is by divine grace. And the proper way to achieve divine grace is through ritual, so that you can actually attune yourself to the divine. Now they're both doing the same thing. One is a more
Yeah.
active and one a more passive approach. But I feel that in the early days, he was more along the Iamblichus line of things, and he was writing a lot about the occult. He wrote about ceremonial magic, and his statements were very bold. He made bold statements about America and all kinds of stuff that was reminiscent of, to me, of Theosophy and of Blavatsky, who were huge influences on him. And Blavatsky could be quite militant, as we know. And but when I knew him, he was like this old Chinese sage
Hmm.
mixed up with a little bit of Maslow, maybe. And he was so gracious and charming and funny. And I mean, one of the things that he did, Tamra wrote a memoir about our friendship with him, in which he discusses these things more eloquently than I am. But for instance, with her, he would just make her laugh. We would be having a deep discussion with his wife Marie and with him, and then when no one was looking, he'd turn around and he'd make some weird face at her or something just to make her laugh, and she would. They became really good friends. And I know that people would ask me, well, what did he keep by his bed? Like, what did he read at night?
Hmm.
And what he kept by his bed were joke and cartoon books. and
That's
also
funny. That's what
and
popped into my head is like joke books. Yeah.
you're right.
Wow.
And stamp books. He loved collecting stamps. He loved looking at the various stamps. And so he was so wholesome on a level.
Mm.
And I don't think he was in the beginning. Now Marie said that when she met him, he was a scary customer. And you can see this in some of his older pictures where he's really dramatic. And he's looking sort of like a warlock in a 1930s movie or something. And
Mhm.
and she said that he lived in this creepy Frank Lloyd Wright house. It's the same house that they used in Blade Runner and in the House on Haunted Hill. He was
Wow.
allowed to live there because the rain would come in and the bees would make big nests in it, and the owner just couldn't handle it. And he was an admirer of Manly Hall, so he said, "Why don't you live there?" And he would have these big parties there with swamis and Hollywood actresses and all kinds of stuff going on. And she said he had as she put it, a creepy dwarf manservant. I don't know anything about that except what she said. And that he had blackout curtains on all the windows. And when you'd come in there at noon and it would be dark as night. So
Oh,
that I
man.
didn't know that Manly Hall,
He had
but
a flair for the dramatic,
he did.
obviously. Yeah.
Very much so. And then she claimed that she was the reason for the big change because she said that once they got married, she said that she made sure that he got up in the morning and had a good German breakfast and all the windows were opened. No more dwarf manservant. So
Yeah,
the
just
man
for
that I
dramatic
met,
effect, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So the man that I met was so not like that.
Mm.
I didn't know that he had been friends with mayors and governors and that he'd had stars around him and all that. I mean, there was nothing like that going on. A little bit. There were people like John Denver and Burl Ives that were hanging out with him, but it was so different. It was such the cars in the lot, were humble middle class, lower middle class. That was his following, and he loved to talk about really deep. He loved Neoplatonism, for example, and he used to give classes in it. But he found that for most of his following, they didn't really need that. Like they could use a little bit of it, but the point was, how do I apply this so that my life is
Mm.
better? And so
Right.
he became quite masterful at being able to take ancient wisdom and apply it to everyday problems.
Distill it. Yeah. The real alchemy, right?
Hmm.
Distilling it down to some life-giving essence or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, I want to see the kind of biopic about him, especially back in those times.
If you have not
Yeah,
read Tamra's book, which is called Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, my 7 years in occult Los Angeles with Manly Palmer Hall, that's the title. It's Inner Traditions. Put it out,
great.
I think 2021, the end of 2021. It's a short book, a beautiful little read, and she really captures what it was like being there because we'd hang out with them. They invited us to their house all the time, and we would go out to restaurants, their favorite restaurant with them, and they were so kind to us. They were
Mm.
like grandparents that we had never had, and I still can't believe it. I mean, people have asked
Yeah.
me, why did they choose, why were you chosen to do that? Why was
Uh-huh.
this your luck? And the only answer I give is that I think that he was really a believer in the flow of
Mhm.
Li, of the Tao. And I think that he needed somebody who had some knowledge of languages to finish this thing because the guy who had done the lion's share of the work on it refused to do a couple editorial decisions that were a big deal to him, which involved taking out references to bodily fluids that he had included in his records of what some of the recipes were in these alchemical manuscripts. As an academic, he knew that that was something that would be of interest to academia. But Manly
Mhm.
Hall thought, I've seen too many people get in trouble doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And I also, my following, the people who will probably buy the book, they're not going to want to read those words
Mm.
in that
Yeah.
place. It's supposed to be full of inspiration. So he wanted that out, and the academic
Right.
refused. And so that's what gave me my opening. And that guy was very kind to me. He really helped me get started in that task. And
Nice.
so it really was, I think, just that I walked in with that language facility at the right moment, and he trusted
Mhm.
nature. And he
Yeah.
thought, if,
Yeah.
well, this must be the right person. And I turned out I was the right person. I did a really good job on it. He thought so. And I didn't have that much to do, but I was able to contribute in some ways. And for me, of course, it was just a amazing, all the books that he told me about, all the things. I mean, the triangular Saint Germain manuscript. I got to hold that and talk to him. What is this? What does this mean? What is the translation of it? And
Yeah. So it does sound like you were really the kind of perfect person. And it sounds like he was just an incredibly intuitive guy as well. So perhaps he could see that you were the right person for the job, and that it would also have something to do with your karma or your destiny to meet him and get this education and kind of pull yourself out of this darkness that you'd been in when you were younger.
hmm yeah,
Yeah.
it was an amusing interaction where in the early days where I was just working on the bibliography, and he was working on one of his astrological articles for the journal, and and I had the stupidity to say to him, "Do you really believe in that stuff? Like, you really think that the stars in some way influence our behavior?" He was tickled by that. And he said, "Well, he said, you don't really have the knowledge to debate me on the subject. So let me introduce you to this wonderful woman, Peggy, who's a great astrologer, and she'll teach you enough about astrology so that you can come back and debate me about it." Well, of course, Peggy blew my mind, and I never debated him about it because there was clearly something going on there, and I went about studying it myself. But he was typically doing things like that. Also, his jokes were always had some kind of meaning in them. He had a way of telling you a joke and making you laugh, and then a half an hour later you'd realize that he was actually talking to you about something. Very
Mm.
charming. So the my book actually started in the vault when I was having lunch with him, and I saw on the bottom shelf this big leather bound book. I love these big tomes, so I grabbed it. I said, "Can I pick up that one?" He said, "Sure." So I picked it up and opened it, and it says The Platonists. It's actually a series of issues of a newspaper that was published in the 1880s near St. Louis, Missouri. And this is the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Mm.
And at that time, St. Louis, although it was just beginning to become industrialized, was a cow town. It was still the principal hub for cattle. And so I could not understand how this thing came to be. And when I
Yeah.
opened it up and really looked through it, I found that there were, for example, translations by Thomas Taylor of the authors we've already mentioned, Iamblichus and Plotinus, and of course Plato. But there were also translations by someone named Thomas Johnson, and there were articles by this fellow Alexander Wilder that I knew had been involved somewhat with Blavatsky, and then even more stunning was Abner Doubleday, who was a Civil War general on the Union side, who supposedly fired the first shot at Fort Sumter on the Union
Mm.
side. He was falsely credited with inventing baseball, but a real American character, a mainstream kind of guy. He had done a translation of Eliphas Levi writing about transcendental magic in there. So I asked Mr. Hall about it. What is this? He didn't know much about it either. There just wasn't a lot of information available. That really got me, and that really is the beginning. That's the first thread that I pulled on that turned into all the things in this book. And eventually, I found a book written in 1962 called Platonists of the Midwest, and that explains some of the things. Right?
I
I
mean, it
mean,
just seems so incongruous.
it's
That
so
was the
weird. And
biggest thing with your book for me, was just dispelling a lot of these ideas about I had about early American settlers being kind of Christian Puritans. You know,
yeah,
that's what we see in the movies. It's either that or the gunfight at the OK Corral.
yeah.
But to hear that there's Platonists in the Midwest in the 1800s, it's like, what?
And it was
What's
very
going on there? You know?
popular. I pictured Western town, wooden sidewalk. There's a light on, it's an oil lamp up in some window, and there's some weird guy in there doing the Platonist. That wasn't the case at all. It was very popular. There were big clubs in the Midwest that would meet to have parties to celebrate Plato's birthday, and they had generally they were predominantly women. And there was this fellow Hiram K. Jones, who was they called him the American Plato, and he would lecture for hours about Plato and Platonism. And this dovetailed with what was happening at Concord with the New England Transcendentalists. So Emerson was in touch with the people involved with the Platonist, and they would often turn to the editor, Thoreau and Alcott, and he would turn to the editor of the Platonist if they had questions about any of the Platonic doctrine. And so sometimes the Platonists would lecture there, and other times that they would come out to visit. So Emerson was always sending letters to this guy living just outside St. Louis. And it was actually a vital culture, and big newspapers and magazines were carrying articles about Plato. Things like, oh, there's a new translation coming out from Yale, and it was a big deal to people. And they had these apologetic kind of apologist articles saying, well, you know, this Platonic stuff really is very much what led into Christianity. So in studying this, we're studying our own Christian roots and understanding them better. Really weird. And it influenced spiritualism greatly because these concepts were floating around everywhere. And so when spiritualism began to come up with its own doctrines, so much of it had this Platonic feeling to it. And so that is where the book started, in that conversation, seeing that book and trying to figure out what that was. And so when I was touring with my band, I would go to libraries and I would go to bookstores and looking for things, just looking for more information. And the beautiful thing was that around 2000, there was just this sea change in academia where esoteric studies were suddenly becoming more acceptable. It was slow, but there were articles and books coming out about things that had never been written about before, or that revolutionized our views of things that had only been written about by esotericists who did not have access to the archives that these people had access to. So that was just incredible. And it led to me writing a blog in the 2010s about American metaphysical religion, just trying to share some of the things I had found. And to my shock, academics contacted me. They liked what I had written, and one was actually inspired to go and work on the Thomas Johnson material and on the history of the Platonists. And he became a mentor, K. Paul Johnson, a great scholar, and many others have been really incredible. I mean, in this book, I've had so much help from academics. It's really humbling. But the information that they have about all of the interests that we have, Rosicrucianism in Europe, or if you prefer Rosicrucianism in the colonies, or if you prefer Rosicrucian orders that developed in America, we have now books upon books about these subjects and articles that open up whole new vistas. And that's part of the inspiration behind getting this book published. Was I wanted people like me who are enthusiasts about this material and who really love it to have access to it, because most people don't know the books are there. And if they do, they can't afford them. And the other thing that I was lucky with was that when I was first putting this book together, Google and Amazon still let you search almost every book that they had archived all the way. So I was able to access these academic books through those two sites and read anything I needed in them. I could, the indexes, I mean, you could just search any book looking for the subjects that you were looking for. And then also being guided to materials, even now. For example, Tamra and I have written a book about the influence of the Orpheus legend and also of the Orphic mysteries in Western culture, because it's another one of those subjects. When you see how much influence it has had, it's stunning. And we also did a new it's not really a translation, I wouldn't say, even though it is a translation, but what we tried to do was to add the details of cult, because our thinking was that the Orphic hymns are pretty boring. They're very formulaic. And the reason is that the priests already knew all the characteristics of the deities they were addressing, but we don't. So we wanted to add back these details of cult so people could really feel the correspondences. And so it is being published in August by Inner Traditions, but we've had so many editors going through that, and we've worked on it so hard, and I was very lucky to have Jay Bregman, who's a great Platonic scholar, look at it. He found 10 stupid mistakes in it. Just so, and this is after other academics had been through it. So I really feel so grateful to them, and I highly recommend to anyone writing in this area this old idea that the esotericists hate the academics and the academics hate the esotericists, which I still run into a lot. That was not my experience. And I really encourage people who are writing on these subjects to reach out to the academics who write in those areas, because they're thrilled too to have people who are genuinely enthusiastic get the material that they've worked so hard to bring out into the world. And
exactly, yeah. People who are reading academic papers, it's, maybe 50 people read a particular paper on an esoteric subject. But one of the great things about your book is that you present it in a way that's very accessible and good storytelling.
thank you.
And man, it is a sprawling story. There are so many wild characters in early American history. And like I said before, really dispelling the perception that it was all Christian Puritans or wild men of the West or something. There was a real richness and diversity to the spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Like at one point in the book, someone was writing about these early settlers, and it was like less than 30% actually went to church, and even fewer had Bibles in the homes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of like the numbers that we're seeing now in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. It was John Butler in 1979. He studied this, and he came to the shocking conclusion that this is after 1650 in New England, that only about 1/3 of the adults ever belonged to a church at all. And then when he went into the middle and southern colonies just before the American Revolution, only 15% identified themselves as being connected to any particular church. And we do have various records. We have a New York governor, and we also have some preachers complaining about how they can't get these people into the pews. They just don't want to attend. And so this is, I think, partially because so many people came here to get away from being forced into some kind of conformity by authority. And this saturates American culture because they kept moving further west or further south or or north just to get away from people who are telling them what to do. And you find this I think in its most dramatic form in the story of, I'm trying to figure out which one to go to first. I guess John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Boston Colony, and who we consider him to have been like the Puritans' Puritan in the way we're taught history. Well, his son, John Winthrop the Younger, who was the first governor of Connecticut Colony, this guy was an alchemist. He's somebody who went to Europe to find Rosicrucians, and when he couldn't find any, he came back and he decided to live according to Rosicrucian ideals, and he did. When he moved to America, I often tell this story because it's just so great. He had crates full of books and manuscripts that belonged to John Dee, and he had all this alchemical stuff, and he marked the crates with John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica. And I've compared that to a Southern preacher's son having pentagrams on his luggage. But this was not really a problem because the Puritans were interested in alchemy. And so this fellow became an intelligencer. He was a hub, one of the hubs where all this cutting edge science and spirituality was being shared by the greatest minds of the time across Europe and in America. And he was constantly trying to recruit them to come to America. And
Mhm.
so he became, for example, an alchemical doctor who served the whole territory and who had famous medicines that apparently worked quite well. And he trained women to diagnose and dispense these colored packets that had each appropriate medication in it. He was very
Mhm.
famed for gold making. But he was also interested in mining and refining, and he also got involved in tribal politics, protecting a tribe that was being basically enslaved by a stronger tribe. One of the results of the diseases that the Europeans brought, devastating so much of the population. And he got right in the middle of that and fairly successfully defended that tribe and actually got some of their rights restored to them, including their names. And he also was someone who was so adept at, so for example, when the crown was trying to get soldiers out of the colonies, he would always figure out these ways. Well, I can't do it right now because we have to do this, but I'm with you and we're going to send you, but they never were sent.
Mhm.
Eventually he was disempowered by the crown, but not before he had left this indelible impression on the area. And he is proof that the Puritans were not what we've been taught that they are. And so is Cotton Mather, by the way, because Cotton Mather, in his eulogy for John Winthrop the Younger, referred to him as Hermes Christianus.
Wow. So this is like all kind of post-Renaissance, like where Marsilio Ficino was doing his darndest to show the Christians that they didn't need to be afraid of alchemy and astrology, and that it was very congruous with Christian teachings and things like that, trying to really syncretize them, right?
Yes,
So I'm guessing that he was maybe kind of following in that tradition, or even Paracelsus, it sounds like, this
yes,
alchemical physician, and
hmm,
bringing that to America.
yes. You've got Paracelsus, you've got Comenius, you've got Giordano Bruno, Agrippa, any kind of Platonic writing they could get their hands on. And of course, Ficino was such a central point for all of this, the rebirth of this idea. And he also is represented to some degree there. So it is certainly within that same tradition. I mean, they're encountering the Hermetica, and they're it's so odd to find like German pietists who, in the Rosicrucian side of their beliefs and practices, are calling back to the Hermetica and to Egyptian and Neoplatonic concepts and trying to unify all of this into a greater universal reformation.
Mhm. Now, in researching your book, so there's this, I don't know, a story, a mythology about the founding of America and the influence of the Freemasons. Where you can look at the architecture around Washington, D.C., and find all of these references to Hermetic symbols. How true is that idea?
There's a lot of Freemasonic influence going on. Now, I don't know that Washington was all designed, and all future developments were pre-designed to have this Masonic. I'm not so sure about that. We don't really have a lot of evidence for that. And some of the assumptions that we hear most about, as I say in the book, fall on the wrong side of a protractor. But on the other hand, there's no
Wait, what do you mean by
question
that?
there's no question that there is Freemasonic symbolism all over the place, and there's no question that they're
What do you
influencing.
what do you mean by it falls on the wrong side of it? That sounds like a Manly P. Hall joke, that. But I want to know, like, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's we've heard, for example, that some of the alignments are aligned in a certain way to sunset and but if you actually go and you do the work, you find that is not it's not so exact. So there's a
I
romanticizing
see.
or idealizing process that has been applied to this so much. And I have to say, Manly Hall definitely contributed in some ways to this. There was a time when he was really into American exceptionalism, and he was pushing a lot of stories. That one of the most famous was that there was somebody who showed up when the founding fathers were getting cold feet about signing the Declaration of Independence, and that this person gave a very stirring speech that convinced them to sign it. And in various traditions, that was an angel. It's also been said that that was Saint Germain, and he too told this story, but it's actually a piece of fiction from a writer who was really famous in the early days of America. It was from a short story. I don't think he knew that. He probably heard about this through a Freemason, and the Freemason probably did not know that it came from this author who, while he was famous then, is very obscure now. But there's a lot of this kind of...
Yeah, they're like memes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like there's one that I see all the time. It's it's purported to be a speech by Chief Seattle. How can you buy or sell the sky or the warmth of the land? It's strange to us. Like Soundgarden even turned those lyrics into a cover of Into the Void. But it turns out that it was part of a play written by an American playwright in the 70s, this kind of like post-hippie romantic play. It's not actually attributed to Chief Seattle, but if you were to believe the meme, and it's just repeated over and over and over again until it becomes a kind of pseudo truth or something. Like, so even before the internet, we had to worry about what is true and fake news and all of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something that impresses me so much about Manly Hall's work, is that he did not have access to what we have. And it's harder to find out what's true, especially for someone who's existing outside academia. And he had no choice but to do that anyway, because there was no place for what he was studying in academia pretty much for all his life, maybe a little bit at the end. But the focus on what is true. And so I'll give you another example of this. I've finished a book about tentatively titled Rosicrucian Origins in Context that is going to be published by IT next year. And it's also based on new research. And one thing that we hear often about is the friendship between Robert Flood and Michael Meyer, and that these were probably actual Rosicrucians. And there's been so much new research that we find that there does not appear to have been any friendship or really any contact between them. And the only reference that anybody's been able to find is that Michael Meyer wrote some kind of nasty things about Robert Flood and his work that really don't sound like what a Rosicrucian would say about another Rosicrucian, even if they were being secretive about it. Now, of course, believers will say that this is all deliberate and it's meant to deflect.
Right. It's all... disinformation and all of that, right?
Another story is that when Frederick, the very unfortunate king of Bohemia, that was the center of so many Rosicrucian fantasies about a new Hermetic emperor that would be crowned, that his decision to take that crown, in the old stories that were told, were that Princess Elizabeth, this fiery English Stuart that he married, was the one who told him to do it, because his mother said, "Don't you dare do that. That's way too dangerous. You're going to insult the Habsburgs, and the church will use this to take our lands because they're so rich." And supposedly he agreed with that. But then the story is told that Elizabeth Stuart came walking into the room with her plunging neckline, and she delivered a stirring speech about how this was a calling from God, and they had to do it. And this was a terrible disaster as a result. Well, the truth is, after 20 years of study of her papers, this new biography of her, which is superb, showed that she said, "It's not my place to give you advice about this. You have to make the decision." So a lot of that kind of thing going on. And even now, as you say, with the internet, it's hard to tell what is accurate and what isn't, not only in memes, but even when you're dealing with academia. I mean, you have to look at every single book. You can miss things that are in a Russian study that you didn't have access to, but actually has the right interpretation of this because they had access to archaeology that nobody had access to. And as various nations are kind of coming forward with all of this, we're finding more and more of these materials. And what I'm excited about is that my understanding is that in the world of Islamic scholarship, in Islamic countries, that they're finally coming to grips or planning to come to grips with the fact that they have millions of books and manuscripts in archives that have never been looked through. And it's very likely that at least 50% of those materials are related to occult and to Platonic and other pagan sources because they preserved so much of it. So there are these books that we always read about and wish that we could have read, A Life of Pythagoras, and they may have all of it, and it may eventually come out of those archives. And I also wonder about the Vatican and what they have stashed in their archives. So hopefully someday that this human heritage of all this incredible information will be made available. It'll be super exciting to be able to read those lost words again.
Yeah. Do you feel like there is some kind of hermetic revival going on now?
Yeah, I think so, because there's a combination of things. Social media has bypassed so many of the obstacles that were in the way of young people encountering these materials. And they are now able to be teaching each other and sharing what they're discovering. And that's something unprecedented, in my opinion. Also, in academia, thanks to great scholars like Wouter Hanegraaff, I'm pronouncing that right, there's a different viewpoint on all of this. So his viewpoint is, first, that it's not our job to decide if this stuff is true or false. It's our job to preserve it and to present it with as much accuracy and completeness as we can. Also, he has pointed out that there is room for what he calls Gnostic scholars. I don't know if he uses scholars, but for people who are not only students, but practitioners. And in fact, I have found a bunch of people in academia who behind the scenes are very active in the belief systems that they are studying. And that's really new, because that was something that would have been looked down upon, really just censored even 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, like because the belief or the being a practitioner would interfere with your objective scholarship.
Exactly.
Right? And so if you were a practitioner, you had to be a kind of rogue scholar like yourself or Stephen Huller or Manly P. Hall.
And now
so
the
things
attitude,
are changing.
It is. And the attitude now is that it's possible that only a practitioner can really dig into it, because they're the ones who are
as practitioners, we know that. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're finally catching up. So that's that. I think for that reason, there is this explosion going on in this area. And I think that there's also the monotheistic, patriarchal monotheism has led us to a lot of dead ends that are becoming all too obvious to everyone at this point. And there is a precipitous decline in interest in traditional religions because of that. And now that you have access to all this stuff, for me, for example, as I said early in our discussion, when I was looking for answers, even though they were the wrong answers, I didn't know I thought, well, you got to go to Satanists. There's nothing else there. Well, there's so much there. I mean, just even in American history, if you're just interested in America, there's almost anything you can think of is back there. They've tried everything. And it's so exciting, I think, and I do believe, by the way, that this is the secret to the similarity of Manly Hall and Carl Jung is this thirst for the knowledge of world culture, everything about it and how it applies to human spirituality. Mr. Hall would probably use that word, but Jung would probably use something else. But I think that is a big part of it, and that thirst for discovery and seeing these similarities. And it's such a wonderful experience when you are digging through these materials and you find these connections.
Yeah. And I mean, at a time when our culture is becoming more of a global culture, we need more of a universal approach to spirituality that sees the value in all of the diverse traditions. We need that more than ever if we're going to have harmony in this global world. So it seems like the time is ripe. where the spirit of the times is being met with this cultural shift. One of the things I appreciate about your book, and I wanted to touch on this before we end our conversation, is that you talk about what the intersection of the European settlers was with the indigenous Native Americans. Now, this has not been something I'd really read much about at all, that there was actually a kind of exchange, or that some of the European settlers respected what they encountered with the tribes. Can you talk a little bit about this, and
Sure.
you know, if it was a new discovery for you as you started to research the book?
Hmm. Yeah, I was surprised at first that there was such an interest among some of the earliest writers and explorers in the culture, indigenous culture, and how there was this sense that maybe they had something that Europe could really learn from. So, for example, you had Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and you had John Winthrop Jr. in Connecticut, and you had even earlier you had Thomas Harriot, who was brought probably was the first scientist in America doing alchemical experiments on the beach. And we've even found ruins. They're like broken alchemical alembics and things that probably belonged to him. And although he wrote this kind of awful book about the New World, where he has this refrain that he uses constantly, which is, "We took it and ate it." And they ate everything, things that people just shouldn't eat. But he was really writing a business plan for why we should exploit this continent. I always look at it as the first, I mean, there it is. There's the whole corporate future of America in one little book.
Yeah,
But
and so it was a list of all of the different natural resources and how they could be exploited or used or
exactly, and how
extracted. Yeah,
superior they were.
it was like kind of a devil's shopping list or something.
That's beautifully put. Yeah. And yet the same guy was so interested in indigenous culture that he invented an alphabet to try to capture the language. There was great interest in dreams and how they felt about dreams. There was interest in the fact that they seemed to have superior physiques with superior senses, where they could see much further than the pilgrims could see. But also writers who recognized that the respect that the indigenous people gave to their elders and the tenderness with which they treated their children reflected badly on Europe. And also that when they were captors in battles that were taken into indigenous tribes at this time in this place, they were made members of families and treated like children in the family, something that was very different from how the pilgrims were allowing other pilgrims to starve. When they had somebody like Thomas Morton, is another guy that should be mentioned here, the pagan pilgrim, that he was offering to hunt for them. And the elite pilgrims said, "Sure, we'll let you out of your jail cell to hunt for us, but no, you don't hunt for the poor." So this man, he was sent out by the Cavaliers, rounding up our conversation, and
Our brothers, the Cavaliers.
and he was meant to start a trading post and to try to bring something to compete with the pilgrim mentality into the English colonies there. He opened up something that he called Merrymount or Merrymount. And typical of the Cavaliers, this had many puns in it, including having a fun mount, if you know what I mean. And also there was a Latin joke about male genitalia in there, and he built he had a maypole erected for May 1st, and he invited all the local trappers, outlaws, indigenous tribes, pirates. I mean, anybody that wanted to come, including the pilgrims, were invited.
Sounds like a good party.
It was the first wild party ever closed down by the authorities. He was also in America. It was the first. He was the first person to ever publish a fart joke in America. And he
Right, I
was
remember
also
reading
the
that.
first person to be foreclosed upon in American history. All things that the Pilgrims they were after him, and eventually they treated him horribly. They tried to starve him to death. They imprisoned him. They eventually ended the Marymount experiment. But Marymount was this whole other America. It was a place where everyone was welcome, where he cared about the dreams of the indigenous people and about their relationships, and they cared about him. And it's like this other shadow side of America that we've all
Yeah.
forgotten about. And finally, of course,
Yeah, I mean,
there's
well, it was like another alternate path that America could have taken.
yes,
Like there was a different kind of promise happening there that
exactly.
unfortunately just they were probably just a little too kind of proto hippie-ish to fight back well enough.
Well, they were overwhelmed by the hatred and the use of force. Eventually, they showed up to arrest him. He called. I mean, he had these nicknames for them, like Captain Shrimp and stuff like that. They just hated that. But he said that they showed up and they were so savage. He says that if there hadn't been an old veteran there to stop them, that they would have just literally torn him apart.
Yeah, like one
And
guy who knew how to fight. Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Hmm.
And so the he basically was disempowered legally. And at one point he won back some power, but there were so many changes of government going on in England that he didn't really have much of a chance. And plus, he was sent there when he was 50 years old. He founded Marymount at the age of 50, which in itself is kind of amazing for that time when 50 was quite advanced. But his
Yeah.
spirit is so different. It's so filled with humor and
Yeah.
bawdiness, and but also concern and compassion for people who are different than himself. He was compassionate about the Pilgrims. He thought it was tragic the way they were living. He tried, even though they were treating him that way, he tried to teach them to use lime when they built their structures, because anytime it would rain, their structures were falling apart. But they wouldn't do it
Mm.
because he told them that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've got a podcast coming out with a psychologist from San Francisco who's written a lot about middle-aged men and what archetype is the kind of best guiding archetype for them. And he puts it forward that the trickster is something that older men need to embrace more of. And it sounds like he had that spirit, which is all, obviously a kind of revered figure in indigenous society. And so maybe there was that affinity there, like the fart jokes, the making fun of Captain Shrimp, um,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of irreverent attitude that is so at odds with the puritanical kind of uptightness, right,
Yeah.
that we usually think of. Now, I wonder if it's about time for America to find that trickster spirit, so that we, kind of in North America, can get along better here. And yeah, I just wonder if there's something to that, if we kind of pull out and see America in a kind of evolutionary process, if maybe it's not high time to bring back some of that trickster spirit and like the compassion and the inclusiveness, the respect
Mm-hmm.
for others and diversity.
I found that one of the things that this book convinced me of was that trickster archetype is just runs throughout American metaphysical religion. One of the things that shocked me was how often I found people who were frauds but had really wise things to say and actually may have done some fairly good things outside the bad things that they did. I'll give you a really quick example is a fellow named Quimby, who was really the founder of the whole mind cure movement and was the person who gave Mary Baker Eddy the idea for it. She was one of his patients. And he's been somebody held in spiritualist circles and in mind cure circles as this kindly, devout, wonderful old man who was just so holy, and he could talk people out of illnesses essentially because he felt that the spirit was much stronger than the body, if you will. So if you can align somebody properly with the divine and their spirituality wakes up, they can heal themselves instantaneously. And he had
Mhm.
thousands of letters and testimonials from people about cures that he did. Well, as academia caught up, they found that one, he cussed like a truck driver, as we would say these days. He was known to not only try to talk people out of their illnesses, but also to talk attractive women out of their corsets when he was treating them. And he probably didn't write any of the writings that are attributed to him because he was illiterate. And probably the woman who worked for him wrote down his ideas in her eloquent way, and they've been attributed to him ever since. But the man still had some wonderful ideas. And one of my favorite sayings that I found while doing all this, it's so meditative in a way, was he said that, I want to get this right, he said that health is how the body experiences the eternity of the soul. That's something to really think about. And I want to leave you with this about Canada, because you have an interesting heritage to deal with, speaking of tricksters, because of Prince Rupert. And as you know, Prince Rupert was a major figure in the founding of Canada, and you have various places named after him there. And Rupert, who I write about in the Rosicrucian book, is a really difficult, complex trickster kind of character who, on some levels, you just have to love this guy. He was the ultimate cavalier, the ultimate royalist. He was an alchemist. He was an artist. He invented navigational tools and all kinds of stuff, and tools for engraving. And he was the kind of person who was imprisoned by the Habsburg emperor, and a Habsburg noble came to visit him and was so charmed by him that he said, "You've got to meet him," to the emperor. And the emperor met him and said, "Please move in, and I'll give you lands and titles and everything. I just want you to hang out in my court." And Rupert said, no, I would kill my mother if I became a Catholic, because you would have to become Catholic to do that. And so he became notorious during the English Civil War because he had this dog, Boy, who was a white poodle, who was very daring in battle. And the Puritans were terrified of this dog. They said it had witch powers. And so the Cavaliers thought this was hilarious. So they wrote a pamphlet about the witch dog that fought in their army. And they all would like kneel on one knee, and they would hoist drinks to this dog. And it was a terrible tragedy when the dog was killed. It was the first time that Rupert ever lost a battle. And he also had a monkey that he would dress up in a little uniform that would be in battle with him, a little she monkey. And in the end of his life, he would walk with this big black dog, and he was forgotten at that point. He married like some notorious actress, and he lived a quiet life exploring alchemy and esoteric subjects. And he would take these long walks with his black dog, and they would say, "Oh, there goes that wizard." Well, Rupert was somebody who was instrumental in Virginia colony and also in the first Canadian colonies. And it was the first governor, really, of the first colony there. And yet we have to deal with the fact that Rupert is the guy who established the slave trade on behalf of the Stuarts. He was sent by James into Africa. He reached areas of Africa before anybody else did and mapped them. And he encountered tribes. He was looking for gold, but he encountered tribes that were practicing the enslavement of people and for profit. And he thought, since I haven't found any gold, this looks like a good business. And James came back and said, yeah, let's do this. And this is what established this shameful tradition in North America of slavery that enriched the Puritans, the Pilgrims, so much. So he's so problematic because you want to love this guy when you read about him in detail, but then you see that he did one of the most horrendous acts in the history of the colonization of North America. Yeah. Again, a trickster kind of a thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, but also, I mean, they were really kind of victims of the time. They were just dumb about some stuff, you know. But yeah, there's a place in our province, not far from here, named after Prince Rupert, but I don't know anything about the guy. But yeah, he sounds like a fascinating character.
Check him out.
He's going. Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate that. I mean, that's kind of, I'm about one third of the way through American Metaphysical Religion. It is a sprawling tome, and you're kind of tracking all of these threads from Europe back to America.
Mhm.
It's quite amazing, and it's just it's really eye-opening. It really broadens my perspective of the past of
Well, thank
North
you.
America. So yeah, it sounds like you're going to continue being a kind of a lay scholar of sorts and translator of academic um, papers into
Hmm.
something that more people can read.
Yeah.
Your story reminds me quite a bit of Gary Lockman, another
Mhm.
former rock and roller who he worked at the Bodhi Tree, as far as I
Yeah.
know, and
Yeah.
picked
He
up books
actually
on tour. And
he writes about that in my book, actually, about when he worked at the Bodhi Tree. He was kind enough to give me some reminiscences of that, and yeah, he's
mm,
been very supportive, very cool guy. And it also there's a little bit an influence on me a little bit is also Colin Wilson, the
hmm
tone that he took in a sense, and the way that he would synthesize so many apparently separate subjects into something that really turns out to be very related. And
hmm
that's somebody that definitely has influenced me. But obviously, it's the Manly Hall influence. I mean, part of my meaning in doing this book was to to update some of his work with the latest
mm.
research.
That's great. I mean, that's the best way to honor a revered teacher is to continue their legacy and continue to, uh, yeah, update the work as we learn more and as, language changes. You
Hmm.
want people to be able to still relate to it.
Exactly.
So, is the Philosophical Research Society, is it still there and open to the
Yes,
public?
it's still there,
Oh,
and they're having great events, all kinds of interesting things going on. It's not only about spirituality and metaphysics, but all kinds of culture. They've had some great, like really rare horror movies screening there, and they've got great art exhibits, early cinema stuff. It's great. It's developing into a little cultural hub, and they honor Manly Hall regularly and still carry all his stuff, and it's really quite beautiful. It's had a very stormy difficult time of it, and I'm hoping that this new group of people that have sort of clustered around. There's some people that have been there for ever since Manly Hall, but there
mm,
are new people that have been brought in to run some of the things, and they seem to be doing a wonderful job. And if you're ever in the area or anybody who lives in this area, it's a great place to go wander around and find really it's just the library itself, just walking around in it kind of gives you goosebumps because it's so filled with wonderful things.
yeah. And so, are you and Tamara involved with the place?
We're going to be, we're going to do something. I'm not sure exactly what yet. It's a strange thing for us. I've only been back there once or twice. It's a very strange experience, having spent 7 years there with him and then leaving. And then when I go back, even though I love seeing it and I love to be around people who appreciate him, it it's like if you had served Pharaoh and now there was only a tomb. All the stuff is still
Mm,
there, but Pharaoh's not. And if you knew
hmm
Pharaoh, it's tough to be there. That's part of it. But we
Yeah.
do plan to do some things with them, and we want to help them get the word out, and definitely continue to support their activities.
Well, I mean, I can't believe I missed it. When I was in LA, I went to Yogananda's place, the Lake
Mhm.
Shrine, and it was so kind of uptight. I remember I was walking around the lake with some friends, and I had a little wooden flute, and we came upon this statue of Krishna, who's famous for playing his flute
Yeah.
for all the gopis and delighting everyone. And so I pulled out my little flute and I played a little tribute to Krishna. And somebody all of a sudden out of the woods came around with like a button-up shirt and a placard on their chest, said, "You can't play music in here." I was like,
Oh,
I've
wow. Really?
totally
That's
lost the
terrible.
spirit of this place. Like,
I
I'm sure
know.
Yogananda wouldn't have chastised me for
Right?
playing a flute like Krishna. It was just kind of so uptight. And then
Damn hippie.
there's yeah, there's like that Vedantic temple right in Hollywood, like
Yeah.
and I remember going there and it's had that same kind of vibe. It was like the spirits left this place. It's like a dusty, I don't know, relic or
Yeah,
something.
I know what you're
Like
talking about.
the characters that get these places started carry so much of the spirit of it, and I think you probably carry some of that spirit, and I'm sure that's what Manly P. Hall saw in you. Some of that maybe same kind of trickster spirit, the cavalier attitude about some of this stuff, and lack of stuffiness, you know. So thanks for sharing some of these stories with us,
Oh, you're very
and
welcome.
looking forward to the books coming out down the road. Sound
I
great.
look forward to further conversations with you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, man. We'll have to talk rock and roll sometime, and
Yeah, definitely. I want to hear all
the
about
part
those
that plays in
guitars.
our
Yeah.
yeah, and like the part it plays in our lives, and rock and roll is a kind of mystical, magical, spiritual practice in itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Ronnie. Take it easy. Stay dry. I know it's raining a lot
Thank
there
you,
in
Brian.
LA. So take care, and
And
we'll see you down
all
the
you up
road.
in Canada, take your cold back. We don't want it. It's too
Oh,
cold down
come
here right
on.
now.
Oh, it's a beautiful spring day here. We're on a special part of Vancouver Island, right at the southern tip. It's nothing
Oh,
like what people think of in Canada. It's like a temperate rainforest, so it doesn't even
beautiful.
rain as much as Seattle. It's lovely.
That's
Uh,
beautiful.
yeah. So come on up and see us sometime. We got a lot of people who love metaphysical religion up here.
Cool. Yeah, I love it up there.
Yeah.
Those rainforests are just, it's one of those beautiful places on earth.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I pulled a tarot card as we were talking. Can you guess which one it is? Just take a wild guess.
I wouldn't do that.
Come
I don't
on. Take
disrespect oracles.
what
What is
popped
it
into your
though?
head? Who are we talking about here? I mean,
The
Hermetic
Hierophant.
Revival. Well, the Hermit,
Ah, even
another
better. Well, okay, then I will tell you.
curly-haired sage.
Okay, here's the perfect way to finish this then. When you would go to Manly Hall's house, there was an oil painting kind of thing that was up on the outside inside this covered alcove that you could look at to your right when you were waiting for the door to be answered. And what it depicted was a small, like medieval or Renaissance village, and then a long trail up to where the hermit lives.
Oh, cool. Perfect. Thanks, Ronnie.
You're welcome.
Talk to you
Thanks,
later.
Brian. Bye bye.